So let's start with his epistemology. Now, Hume is what we may call a deflationist. He thinks that the idea that we have of ourselves, that the sort of narrative we tell ourselves about ourselves or our self-conception is somehow mistaken. And he thinks that, for instance, we are regularly talking of ourselves as an enduring substance, as a being with continuity in time, that is over and above, that is not to be reduced to our bodily events. And that we have some powers, and that we enter into causal connections, and that with the world, and that we are somehow free. And he thinks that most of the elements of this picture are completely wrong. He also says that we think that there are necessary relations in the world in causation. He thinks that this is a radically mistaken picture. And he is introducing a different way of thinking about things. And this is what makes him so radical in his epistemology.
Could this be summarized with his famous phrase, reason is a slave to the passions?
This is an implication of it,
right,
especially when it comes to his ethics. But you are correct, because the main object of his attack is the traditional understanding of reason, or the reason, you could say, before Hume. Let me say this. Very frequently, we are told that early modern philosophy has a sort of conflict between the three rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and the three empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. But if you really follow closely on what they mean by reason, you will see that basically it's more like Hume versus everyone else.
Right. Because
both Locke and Berkeley did think that the traditional notion of reason applies. So, for instance, Locke is an empiricist on the one hand, but in his politics, he does appeal to a kind of natural law tradition that reason discovers. So in that sense, he's a bit more traditional. Berkeley also thinks that reason is what the traditionals broadly understood it to be. So Hume is putting forward a radically different understanding of reason, where he thinks that basically it's just a sensory computation. It's just a way of calculating with the senses. It's entirely sensory in Hume, whereas in tradition, it's not sensory. It's a non-sensory intellectual power. So if you see the tradition of the Logos from the pre-Socratics and perhaps even before, there is this idea that reason is the noble element within ourselves. Reason is in a sense, the noblest part of the soul.
Is this the Plato analogy of the charioteer trying to steer the two horses of the sensory appetites and the intellectual mind reason at the same time?
Exactly.
Right.
What you're referring to is the idea of reason being dominant in the soul, which you would say is virtue. And it's a form of courage and temperance. And it has to do with reason being the dominant part of the soul, and reason as standing over and above the passions, whereas in Hume, reason is just instrumental. It's just a way of guiding the passions. And in that sense, he is constantly watering down things. He says that, we talk about, Plato, for instance, talks about justice as being virtue in its entirety, virtue with a capital V. But Hume has a much more narrow view of justice. He says justice is just honoring property rights. Of course, he has a very developed theory of virtues, but you see that there is constantly a tendency in Hume to say, most of what other people believe who endorse traditional metaphysics is massively inflated. So he gives forward different views of what things are. So, for instance, he gives a very different view of causation. He's really skeptical of the notion of a power. He thinks it makes no sense. He's really skeptical of the notion of a self. Again, he thinks that it makes no sense. And it's really important to understand why he does this. And in that way, he's one of the most radical epistemologists who ever lived.
So this might be where one of my issues with his epistemology comes in. And later in the text, I'm sure we'll dredge up some quotes, but he says something like, man is one of the most set upon creatures that nature's ever created because he's in a permanent state of want.
Yeah.
And that's why society is beneficial, because it confers upon him not the properties of his mind, which only he can enjoy, not the properties of his body, which can be taken from him, but he says that it's not to the benefit of the person doing the taking, and I think that's a belief that immoral people would actually contest, and I don't think he justifies that properly, but anyway, society confers upon him the material products which make his life far more bearable. And so, if reason is just an apparatus to satisfy the passions, this is my issue with him. Everything seems to be a negotiation. All of society is an artifice. All of human action is a exercise in maximally fulfilling pleasure sustainably. So not at the expense of other people, because if you rob someone else of their pleasure, then if everyone tries to rob everyone else of their pleasure, then no one's going to be pleasured. But if we all live in a harmonious social order, then we're all pleasure seeking. And I don't think that is the main motivator which drives man. I don't think we're just pleasure seeking automatons.
I don't think you would understand passions in terms of pleasure alone. Mm-hmm. But let's keep that a bit for the second and the third section of our discussion. So he's really against traditional metaphysics. And one thing to say about his influence is that he's massively influential, but he was not so influential before the 20th century. But he did piss off people.
Right.
And one of the persons that he pissed off was Thomas Hill Green, who was a major pioneer of British idealism, a very interesting figure. We'll definitely talk about him in the future. I think he's very interesting. And the movement of British idealism is definitely a movement to discuss. But he wrote an introduction to Hume that was bigger than Hume's book. Okay, so he has a book where he's writing about Hume's epistemology, and I think the introduction to it is something like 400 pages. He felt he had to completely demolish Hume.
Right. Okay.
Now, to be fair to him, I think his criticism is very interesting. We will examine it in the future, but just to show that Hume is someone who is very controversial, and he is, let's say, generating all sorts of passions to all sorts of people. Interestingly, he was also cancelled. There are people who call for his cancellation because in his 6,000 pages work, he uses a bad word, and this is why people hate him.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
I'm assuming these are people in modernity.
Yeah. This word, I think, starts with an N.
Okay. Right. It's a product of its time then.
Yep. Okay. So, in order to understand Hume, and bear in mind that Hume is, again, very influential, especially in the 20th century, he is considered to be the philosopher that most academic philosophers identify with. There are many interpretations of his work. So what I will be putting forward is one interpretation. Don't kill me if you disagree with it. But please let me know in the comments. So to understand his influence, I think we need to understand what he does and says about reason. And we are going to talk about Hume's fork and Hume's copy principle. Now, I want to give you a quote that is associated with Hume's fork, what is called as Hume's fork. All the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. Of the first kind are the sciences of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic. And in short, every affirmation which is either intuitively or demonstrably certain, that the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the square of two sides, is a proposition which expresses a relation between these two figures. That 3 times 5 is equal to the half of 30 expresses a relation between these figures. That 3 times 5 is equal to the half of 30 expresses a relation between the numbers. Propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought, without dependence on what is anywhere existent in the universe. Though there never were a circle or triangle in nature, the truths demonstrated by Euclid would forever retain their certainty and evidence. Now, he does something here in this quote, which is one of the first quotes of his A Treatise on Human Nature. Essentially, he starts by saying, well, reason cannot give us facts about the world. Reason, in the traditional sense, does not exist. The operation of thought can only give us relations of ideas, relations of concepts, such as, and propositions such as, all bachelors are unmarried, or 2 times 2 equals 4. He says, these propositions give you no factual content about the world. There is nothing that they tell you about the world if 2 plus 2 equals 4, or all bachelors are unmarried.
Right. So he is saying that reason creates conceptual stand-ins that represent facts, but they are not in and of themselves facts. He says that they're facts about the meanings of the words, but not about the world. So he completely blocks the age-old traditional idea of reason as giving us facts about the world. Right. Okay. Yes, these are human confected concepts to understand the world, even though the number 2 does not literally exist. It is an integer which represents how the world operates. So,
how the mind operates, mostly.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.